At the beginning of the 15th century, Europe found itself torn apart by a profound religious conflict. Two rival popes, each claiming legitimacy as the true successor of St. Peter, had effectively split Christendom into opposing camps. The mutual excommunications and division of allegiances created an environment of uncertainty and instability across the continent. In the midst of this chaos, a clever Florentine banker named Giovanni di Medici identified not a crisis, but an opportunity. Giovanni was no ordinary moneylender. He had inherited a modest currency exchange business and with shrewdness and patience transformed it into one of the most powerful banking enterprises of his time. Giovanni understood that in a world where loyalty could be bought and influence often trumped piety, financial power could open doors that brute force could not. The papal schism was not just a religious disaster, it was a power vacuum. Giovanni realized that if the Medici family could influence the election of a new pope, they wouldn't just gain spiritual favor, they would gain access to the vast, largely unregulated wealth of the Vatican itself. This was not merely a financial strategy, it was a masterstroke in political positioning, with the potential to elevate the Medici from local bankers to continental kingmakers. Giovanni found his perfect candidate in Baldassare Cossa, a man whose past was as ruthless as his ambition. Born into minor Neapolitan nobility at the end of the 14th century, Cossa began his career not in robes, but as a pirate navigating the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean. His years commanding ships in lawless seas honed the cunning and audacity that would come to define his political rise. Eventually abandoning piracy, Cossa pursued studies in canon law at the University of Bologna, eventually earning the rank of cardinal by 1402. At the time, Christendom was still fractured. Pope Gregory XII in Rome and Pope Benedict XIII in Avignon both refused to step down, leaving the church paralyzed. Sensing the opportunity in this stalemate, Cossa aspired to become pope himself, but lacked the resources to make his move. That's when Giovanni de' Medici entered the picture. Seeing a chance to tie the Vatican's fortunes to his bank, Giovanni agreed to finance Cossa's path to power. With Medici funds flowing behind the scenes, Cossa began buying votes, swaying influential cardinals through bribes and promises whispered in secrecy. By 1410, the plan had worked. Baldassare Cossa was elected Pope John XXIII, becoming the third pope in an already fractured Christendom. While his election deepened the crisis, it gave the Medici unprecedented access to the Vatican's finances, and their name became inseparable from the heart of religious power in Europe. Before we move forward, a quick note. If you've made it this far, you probably enjoy stories like this, stories that reveal how history was shaped in the shadows. Our goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers by June 30th, and if you'd like to help make that happen, now's a great time to join the community. Though the schism of the three popes would eventually be resolved, the Medici had already carved out a lasting position in the halls of Vatican power. Their alliance with Pope John XXIII granted them an enduring presence in ecclesiastical finance and political maneuvering. Practically overnight, the Medici family transitioned from relatively unknown Florentine bankers to powerful figures at the intersection of faith and wealth. With their influence growing, Giovanni focused on ensuring the future of his legacy. He began preparing his son, Cosimo de' Medici, to assume leadership. Cosimo was no mere heir. He was intellectually gifted, well-versed in the humanist ideals of the Renaissance, and deeply connected to Florence's rising cultural elite. When Giovanni's health began to fail in the late 1420s, Cosimo was already poised to take control. Upon Giovanni's death in 1429, Cosimo inherited not only the bank, but also the weight of expectation and influence that came with it. Under Cosimo's watchful eye, the Medici would not simply protect what they had built, they would aim higher. But as he began to shape the future, enemies from within Florence's elite were already plotting against him. The next chapter of the Medici saga would unfold not in financial ledgers or church vaults, but in the treacherous realm of Florentine politics. By 1433, Florence had become a cauldron of political tension. The Medici bank's meteoric rise had alarmed many of the city's entrenched noble families, especially the powerful Albizzi clan. Led by Rinaldo degli Albizzi, they viewed Cosimo not just as a rival banker, but as a direct threat to their grip on the Republic. Though Florence still claimed to be a republic, power resided in a rotating council of elite families, and the Medici's growing sway disrupted the balance. In a calculated move, Rinaldo manipulated the city's electoral system, stacking the governing signoria with loyalists. With political momentum in his favor, Rinaldo struck. Cosimo, unsuspecting and still believing he could navigate Florence's politics with diplomacy, was summoned to the Palazzo della Signoria under the pretense of civic discussion. There, he was ambushed, arrested, and confined to a small cell known as the Alberghetto. Rinaldo's intent was clear. He wanted Cosimo executed, but feared the backlash of killing someone so well connected. Instead, he settled for exile, convinced that removing Cosimo from Florence would be the end of Medici influence. But what Rinaldo failed to see was that for the Medici, exile was not a defeat. It was a pause, a strategic retreat before the inevitable return. Cosimo's exile took him to Venice, but his presence remained palpable in Florence. From afar, he began rebuilding his network, not through defiance, but through strategy, extending credit, nurturing alliances, and waiting for his opponents to overreach. Meanwhile, Rinaldo degli Albizzi governed Florence with a heavy hand. His rule, rooted in exclusion and fear, quickly alienated the very merchant class that had once tolerated him. His gravest mistake came in the form of reckless military spending. Attempting to secure dominance through warfare, Rinaldo drained the city's coffers, leading to mounting discontent among both the wealthy and the working classes. Back in Venice, Cosimo's influence grew stronger with each misstep made in Florence. Letters, emissaries, and bank connections kept him at the center of political discussion. The tide began to turn as merchants and noble families once aligned with Rinaldo grew wary of his leadership. They missed Cosimo's steady hand and fiscal competence. By 1434, Florence was ripe for change. Rinaldo's opponents gained enough power to overturn Cosimo's exile, inviting him back to the city with fanfare. Cosimo returned not as a fugitive, but as a redeemer, welcomed by cheering crowds and determined to never again be so vulnerable. Upon reclaiming his place in Florence, Cosimo wasted no time reconfiguring the political landscape. Though he avoided adopting official titles, his control was absolute. He governed from behind the scenes, positioning trusted allies into key roles while preserving the illusion of a functioning republic. But Cosimo's ambitions extended far beyond political dominance. He envisioned a Florence that would stand as a beacon of Renaissance ideals, a city shaped not just by commerce, but by art, intellect, and civic pride. To realize this vision, he became one of history's most significant patrons of the arts. He funded architectural projects that redefined the city's skyline, including the sober yet majestic Medici Palace designed by Michelozzo. He commissioned sculptures from Donatello and paintings from Fra Angelico, establishing Florence as a cultural capital. His investments weren't only about beauty, they were instruments of power and legacy. By embedding the Medici name into the fabric of the city's greatest achievements, Cosimo ensured that their influence would endure for generations. What had begun as a financial empire was now transforming into a dynasty, one that blended politics, art, and vision into a new kind of rule. By the 1440s, Cosimo de' Medici had fully cemented his role as Florence's undisputed power broker. His influence over the city's political Machinery, cultural institutions, and economic lifeblood was unrivaled. Yet he never governed through fear or brute force. Instead, Cosimo mastered the subtle art of loyalty, rewarding allies with opportunities, shielding them from hardship, and ensuring the Medici bank's prosperity flowed into the hands of those who supported his vision. One of his most iconic contributions came with the commissioning of Donatello's bronze statue of David, the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, embodying both defiance and grace. This wasn't merely art, it was a statement. Florence, under Medici stewardship, was not looking backward but forward, into a future where humanism, creativity, and reason were paramount. Cosimo also understood that true influence wasn't restricted to the city's borders. Through careful diplomacy and the forging of intercity alliances, he ensured that Florence's stature on the Italian peninsula was growing in tandem with its cultural prestige. When Cosimo passed away in 1464, he was mourned not just as a financier, but as the father of Florence's Renaissance, a man whose leadership had turned a republic into a symbol of artistic and intellectual rebirth. Following Cosimo's death, leadership of the Medici family passed to his son Piero, a man plagued by chronic illness and frailty. Known as Piero the Guti, his reign was short and largely uneventful in terms of innovation, yet it managed to preserve much of what Cosimo had built. But in 1469, Piero died at just 53, and the Medici legacy faced a pivotal moment. His two sons, Lorenzo and Giuliano, were still young, with Lorenzo, the elder, just 20 years old. Despite his youth, Lorenzo displayed an early aptitude for leadership, combining sharp intellect with a magnetic personality that captivated both the people and the elites of Florence. At his father's funeral in San Lorenzo, the weight of expectation settled on his shoulders. Determined to protect and expand the Medici influence, Lorenzo stepped into the political arena with resolve. However, his rise would not be unchallenged. Unbeknownst to him, a deadly conspiracy was already taking shape, one that would not only test his leadership but endanger his life. The Pazzi family, powerful bankers with deep resentment toward Medici dominance, joined forces with external actors, including Pope Sixtus IV himself, to orchestrate a violent overthrow. Florence was about to be thrust into one of its most dramatic and bloody episodes. On April 26, 1478, the plot against the Medici unfolded in the most sacred of settings. During High Mass at Florence's Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Pazzi conspirators had chosen their moment with care. Their plan was to assassinate both Lorenzo and Giuliano simultaneously in front of the public eye, eliminating the Medici presence in one swift stroke and seizing control of the Florentine government in the resulting chaos. As the choir sang and the congregation bowed their heads, the assassins struck. Giuliano was fatally stabbed multiple times and died on the cathedral floor, surrounded by horrified worshippers. Lorenzo, however, managed to survive. Though wounded, he fought off his attackers with the help of loyal allies and managed to escape to the safety of the sacristy. Blood stained the altar, and in seconds, the sacred space had become a battlefield. News of the attack spread through the city like wildfire, but instead of paralyzing Florence, it galvanized the population. Supporters of the Medici rallied in defense of Lorenzo. The conspirators' plan unraveled rapidly. Attempted coups at the Palazzo della Signoria failed, and many of the plot's leaders, including Francesco de Pazzi and Archbishop Francesco Salviati, were captured and publicly executed. Their bodies were left hanging from the windows of the government palace, a warning to any who would challenge the Medici again. The failed conspiracy had a profound and immediate effect. On Lorenzo, once a rising political figure, he was now a symbol of survival, a man who had stared death in the face and emerged stronger. The people of Florence began referring to him not just as Lorenzo de' Medici, but as Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. He embraced the role with new determination, reshaping Florence's government into a finely tuned instrument of Medici control. While maintaining the facade of a republic, Lorenzo centralized power by establishing a Council of 70, comprised entirely of loyalists. Traditional mechanisms of governance were sidelined, and a new oligarchy emerged under his guidance. Yet Lorenzo was no tyrant. He recognized that his power depended not only on suppression, but on inspiration. He used taxation strategically, punishing adversaries while rewarding allies and funding large-scale public works to keep the common people content. His patronage of the arts expanded to legendary heights. He discovered a young Michelangelo Buonarroti and ensured his training under the best artists and philosophers. Lorenzo also encouraged the curiosity of a polymath named Leonardo da Vinci, who under Medici influence would begin crafting inventions, studying the human body, and producing masterpieces that blended science and art. Under Lorenzo, Florence became the very heart of the Renaissance, not by chance, but by design. If you're enjoying this journey through Renaissance power and betrayal, take a second to like this video and subscribe. It helps more people discover these forgotten corners of history, and it tells us you're ready for the next chapter. When Lorenzo died in 1492, Florence trembled with uncertainty. His son, Piero de' Medici, inherited a legacy of immense power, but also an increasingly complex political landscape. Unlike his father, Piero lacked the diplomatic finesse and strategic brilliance necessary to manage the fragile balance of alliances and threats surrounding the city. Almost immediately, Florence faced external pressure in the form of an advancing French army led by King Charles VIII. The French king sought to march south through Italy with a formidable force equipped with modern artillery, aiming to claim Naples. As tension mounted, Piero hesitated. He first attempted a policy of neutrality, but overwhelmed by fear and indecision, he capitulated to Charles's demands. In a moment of panic, he ceded Pisa and other key Florentine territories without resistance, a move seen by many as cowardice and betrayal. News of the surrender spread rapidly, and public outrage exploded. Even Piero's allies began to abandon him. In a matter of days, the once proud heir of the Medici dynasty was forced to flee the city he had been born to rule. Florence, for the first time in decades, was without Medici leadership. But power abhors a vacuum, and in the absence of the family that had defined an era, a new force was waiting to rise. Into the void left by Piero stepped a man of stark contrast, Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose fiery sermons had already begun to captivate the disillusioned people of Florence. Born in Ferrara in 1452, Savonarola abandoned a promising medical career to embrace a monastic life of discipline and devotion. By the 1480s, he claimed to receive divine visions, foretelling apocalyptic judgment and moral reckoning. To many, these proclamations seemed like madness. But to a population exhausted by corruption, war, and inequality, his message was electric. He denounced the opulence of the church, the greed of bankers, and the vanity of Renaissance art. The Medici, long associated with wealth and cultural extravagance, became his primary targets. When Piero fell, Savonarola saw providence in action. He positioned himself as a moral savior, declaring Florence the new Jerusalem, a city reborn through faith and righteous rule. Under his influence, a theocratic government took hold. Artworks deemed sinful were burned in great bonfires of the vanities. Strict laws against gambling, excess, and immorality were enforced. Savonarola's Florence was not one of beauty and humanism, but of repentance and fear. For a brief period, the city that had once been the jewel of the Renaissance was transformed into a somber bastion of puritanical zealotry. Savonarola's rule, however, was destined to clash with the very institution he had hoped to purify. His defiance of papal authority and his claims of divine guidance unnerved the Vatican. At first, the Church attempted to co-opt his influence, but when that failed, they turned to suppression. In 1498, after excommunicating him, Pope Alexander VI ordered his arrest. Savonarola was captured, tortured, and publicly executed in Florence's main square, hanged and burned, his ashes scattered to prevent martyrdom. With his death, Florence was again thrown into turmoil. Though the Medici name had been expelled from the city, its legacy lingered. The family's political machinery had been dismantled, but its roots, in art, finance, and influence, remained deep in the soil of Florence. And while Piero had disgraced the dynasty, another Medici was quietly preparing for a different path to power. Giovanni de' Medici, younger brother of Piero and son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, had been groomed from childhood not as a ruler of Florence, but as a prince of the church. At just 13 years old, he had been appointed cardinal, a strategic move orchestrated by Lorenzo to secure long-term Medici influence in Rome. It was a seed planted early, one that would soon bear powerful fruit. In the early 16th century, Giovanni de' Medici emerged as one of the most prominent figures within the Catholic Church. Despite the Medici's weakened political position in Florence, Giovanni's standing in Rome continued to rise, bolstered by careful diplomacy and a fortune inherited from his family's vast banking empire. When Pope Julius II died in 1513, Giovanni seized the opportunity. Leveraging his connections and wealth, he secured enough support among the cardinals to be elected pope. On March 11, 1513, Giovanni was crowned as Pope Leo XI, becoming the first Medici to ascend to the highest spiritual office in Christendom. His papacy was immediately marked by extravagance. Leo X viewed the papal throne not only as a religious institution, but also as a stage upon which to display the grandeur of the Medici name. He poured vast sums into the arts, commissioning works from Raphael and Michelangelo, and hosted opulent festivities that dazzled European courts, but his lavish spending came at a cost. In order to replenish the Vatican's rapidly draining coffers, he expanded the controversial practice of selling indulgences, payments made by believers in exchange for forgiveness of sins. It was a decision that, while financially effective in the short term, would ignite one of the greatest upheavals in church history. Among those most outraged by the Church's growing corruption was a German monk and theologian named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther penned his 95 Theses, a list of grievances that directly challenged the authority of the papacy and condemned the sale of indulgences as a perversion of Christian faith. He nailed the document to the door of a church in Wittenberg, an act of defiance that would reverberate across Europe. Pope Leo X underestimated the gravity of the protest, dismissing Luther as just another dissenter. But what Leo failed to grasp was the momentum Luther's ideas would gather in an age of printing presses and rising dissatisfaction with Rome. As Protestantism spread rapidly through Germanic states and beyond, the Catholic Church began to fracture. Yet during this period of spiritual crisis, Leo X remained focused on consolidating Medici influence. He elevated his young nephew, Giulio de' Medici, to cardinal, preparing him for a future role in the Church's highest ranks. Even as Europe drifted into religious conflict, Leo saw the papacy as a family legacy to be secured, but his own health was in decline. Years of indulgence, both literal and political, took their toll. In December 1521, at the age of 46, Pope Leo X died suddenly, leaving the Vatican once again in turmoil, financially strained and politically vulnerable. After Leo's death, the Church briefly turned away from Medici influence by electing Adrian VI, a Dutch reformer known for his austerity. But his papacy lasted only 2 years, ending abruptly in 1523. Under mysterious circumstances, the vacancy reignited Medici ambitions. Giulio de' Medici, Leo's nephew, now stepped forward. A seasoned statesman and skilled negotiator, Giulio maneuvered deftly within the conclave, securing support through promises of stability and papal patronage. He emerged victorious and was crowned Pope Clement VII. But Clement's reign would be marked by one of the darkest episodes in Vatican history. Europe, now divided between reformist and Catholic powers, teetered on the edge of collapse. In an effort to protect the Church's independence, Clement aligned with France and the League of Cognac, opposing the growing might of Emperor Charles V. It was a miscalculation that proved disastrous. In 1527, enraged by what he saw as betrayal, Charles unleashed his imperial army on Rome. Poorly defended and unprepared, the Eternal City fell quickly to the invading forces. For months, Rome was pillaged, churches desecrated, priceless art destroyed, and thousands murdered. Known as the Sack of Rome, the event was a brutal reminder of how fragile papal power had become. Clement narrowly escaped with his life, fleeing through secret corridors to the Castel Sant'Angelo. But the Medici's prestige was deeply scarred. In the wake of the sack of Rome, the Medici struggled to reassert their grip on Florence. Pope Clement VII, determined to re-establish control over the city, installed his illegitimate son, Alessandro de' Medici, as duke. Alessandro's rule was intended to restore order, but it quickly devolved into a reign of fear and repression. He rewarded loyalty with privilege, but dealt harshly with dissent, exiling or executing perceived enemies. His personal life was equally controversial, marked by scandal and extravagance, and his reputation deteriorated rapidly among the Florentine nobility. Though he held power, Alessandro was increasingly isolated, and enemies plotted in secret. In 1537, his own cousin, Lorenzino de' Medici, lured him into a private meeting under the guise of arranging a romantic liaison. Once alone, Lorenzino and a co-conspirator ambushed Alessandro, stabbing him to death and ending his volatile reign. Florence again descended into chaos, leaderless and fractured. With no clear successor, the city teetered on the edge of civil war. Yet from this political vacuum, a new figure would emerge, not as a puppet of the elites, but as a ruler in his own right. His name was Cosimo, a distant Medici relative raised in the countryside, far from the turmoil of court politics. At just 17, he would change the course of the family's history once more. Cosimo de' Medici was an unlikely candidate for leadership. Young and untested, he was chosen by Florence's governing elite precisely because they believed he could be manipulated. But within months of taking power, Cosimo proved them wrong. He acted swiftly and decisively to eliminate rival factions, consolidate authority, and rebuild Florence's military might. He formed a loyal personal guard and began replacing unreliable nobles with those who owed their fortunes to him. His leadership style blended ruthless pragmatism with long-term vision. No longer content with merely defending Medici influence, Cosimo set his sights on expansion. In 1554, with the backing of Spanish forces, he laid siege to the rival city-state of Siena. The campaign was brutal, stretching over 15 months and reducing Siena to starvation before the city finally capitulated. With this conquest, Cosimo unified much of central Italy under his control. In 1569, his efforts were rewarded when Pope Pius V granted him the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany, a significant elevation from local lordship to royal status. The Medici were no longer simply influential bankers or papal allies. They had become monarchs. Cosimo ruled with absolute authority, blending military strength, political cunning, and cultural patronage to turn Tuscany into a stable, centralized state. The boy, They thought they could control, had become a sovereign. As Cosimo aged, his legacy appeared secure. He had transformed the Medici into full-fledged royalty, ruled Tuscany with discipline, and established dynastic authority that seemed unshakable. Yet no dynasty is immune to decay. Upon Cosimo's death, the Grand Duchy passed to his son Francesco, a man who lacked his father's vision and strength. Francesco's reign was plagued by corruption, administrative neglect, and personal scandal. While Cosimo had led with a sense of civic duty and ambition, Francesco governed with disinterest. His court grew decadent, and his public projects diminished. His marriage to Joanna of Austria was cold and politically motivated, while his open favoritism toward his mistress, Bianca Capello, alienated much of the nobility and church. Economic stagnation set in, and Florence began to lose its cultural luster. When Francesco died suddenly in 1587, Tuscany was in decline. The Medici still ruled, but their grip was weakening. Over the following decades, the family's relevance waned. Though they retained titles and palaces, their power was increasingly ceremonial. Their bank long collapsed, their alliances fractured. They had once shaped popes and kings, artists and empires. Now they fought to remain remembered. The once formidable name of Medici began to fade from the corridors of influence, echoing more as legend than authority. But the Medici had one final act to play, not in Italy, but on the throne of France. Catherine de' Medici, born into the chaos of Florentine politics, had been married off as a teenage bride to Prince Henry of France. For years, she remained in the shadows, dismissed by the court and ignored by her husband. But when Henry became king and later died in a tragic jousting accident, Catherine emerged as the true power behind the French crown. Acting as regent for her underage sons, she maneuvered through the religious civil wars that tore France apart, balancing between Catholic and Protestant factions in a desperate effort to preserve the monarchy. Her rule was controversial, marked by the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered. Yet, despite the bloodshed, Catherine succeeded in maintaining the Valois dynasty through decades of turmoil. When she died in 1589, the French throne passed out of her family's hands, and the Medici's political chapter closed for good. In Florence, the family's male line eventually ended with Gian Gaston de' Medici in 1737, leaving no heir. The Medici legacy, once forged in banking, blessed by popes, glorified by artists, and immortalized in palaces, came to a quiet end. Yet their impact endures. In every corner of Florence and beyond, their story remains etched in stone, canvas, and memory, a testament to ambition, resilience, and the art of power. Now that the Medici story has reached its end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment stood out to you the most? Was it a turning point, a betrayal, or a surprising act of resilience? Let me know in the comments. Your insight helps shape what we explore next.